Welcome to the For the Love of Language podcast. I'm EJ.
And I'm Stacy, the linguist. Welcome on in, friends. This is another podcast exclusive because Stacy is still getting over COVID.
But we're here.
And we're here.
Excited to be here and glad that Stacy's feeling at least better.
Yes. What do we want to talk about today, EJ?
So let's talk about names. Names. This is like a pretty broad topic.
It's a very broad topic. I feel like we could make several episodes about this. And I was just telling EJ before we got things started, I have several physical copies of journals that are just about names. So the study of names is called onomastics, I believe is how I pronounced it. And it's its own like area of study that's sort of a sub-branch of linguistics, sort of a sub-branch of like sociology, because it does like naming practices have a lot of overlap with a few different areas of social science.
Definitely. So maybe a fun question to start out with. What things have you named in your life?
There was a time where I named like everything I could. You know, it started out, I think we all start out with, naming our toys, right? As children, you name like your stuffed animals, you name your Barbie dolls, you name your G.I. Joes, right? Or they come with names. But like as I grew up, I started naming other things. Any like inanimate objects that were like significant to me. So like pieces of technology, like my iPod or my laptop, my first car. Well, in fact, all of my cars have had names.
That's pretty common with vehicles.
Yeah, it's very common to name like vehicles, right? Anything that was like worthwhile, I named. And I did have like I still do kind of have a strategic naming practice for those things like my cars and stuff.
I want to know what your strategic naming practice is.
In case y'all didn't know, Stacy's a big nerd, and I wanted to be a performer when I was a kid, and so I named everything after characters from Shakespeare plays.
That's cool.
So my very first car was named Mercutio. No, it was something. It was Romeo's best friend. Who's Romeo's best friend?
I don't remember. It
was Hamlet's best friend. I forgot his name. Oh my God. But yeah, it was something like Mercutio. And it was Hamlet's best friend, I think, which was a bad choice because Hamlet's best friend dies and that car got wrecked. My second car was my very first Fiat, which I named Don Adriano de Armado. Anybody... Yeah, it's a character from Love's Labour's Lost, which is a little bit more obscure of a Shakespeare play. But yeah, and I named everything, even my ukulele. I'm going to show, I have it here. So I'm just going to show EJ. Y'all can't see it. But look, you can tell what year I did this because it has a mustache on it. And that was like, there was a period in the 2000s where everything had mustaches on it. And then in glitter sparkle letters, I put the name Jacquinetta. So my ukulele's name is Jacquinetta. So I have very odd naming practices that are still around. Horatio, that was the name of my first car. His name was Horatio.
Yes, Horatio. That sounds more familiar.
I knew it had a Ishio at the end. But yeah, so all of my objects have, as of like once I was like 12, all of my significant objects got named after Shakespeare characters.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, I don't think I ever had the pet rock. I do name my car, my motorcycle. They have names. And then, I have 3 dogs and a toddler.
Yes, and those are a little bit more important naming. I haven't had living things to name, let alone a child. How was it picking a name for your kid?
My husband and I are very systematic, very logical people at times.
Yes,
and so
you very much are. Can confirm, knowing both of you.
Right. So what we did is we created a spreadsheet
Oh, spreadsheet.
We created a spreadsheet, and I had a list of names and he had a list of names. We looked through the social security list of the most common names. We like compared our lists, we rated the names. And, then we actually also tried saying them out loud, putting
Mhm.
like the first and the second like middle names together, making sure that it sounded good with the last name.
Mhm.
So yeah, we made sure to try saying them. I
Mhm.
personally have favorite phonemes, I guess.
Mhm.
So like for
We all
me,
do. And people don't want to admit it, but you do. You have a favorite phoneme. You all do. I know it.
right? Yeah, so for me, the J affricate
Mhm.
is one of my favorite phonemes.
Yeah, it was funny. But on Instagram, I did like a ask me anything situation, and someone asked what my favorite affricate was, and it's the j, the sound, the j.
Mhm.
It's just a good one. It's a
It
rare one. You don't find
is.
it in a lot of languages.
Yeah, it's a great sound.
Yeah.
So yeah, we had our favorite sounds, names that called out to us, names that spoke to us. So we considered like family names that we could use.
Hmm.
So we had a rather long process, but I was actually only a few months pregnant when we were pretty sure about the name that we wanted to use. Some people are like,
Wow.
"Oh, you'll have the baby and then you'll have this flash of inspiration and then you'll know." And I'm like, "Nah, I've known
Might
for
as
a
well just prep
while."
in advance, you know?
Right? Not really my style. So yeah, that was kind of the process that we went through with our child, which, I've been very, very happy with the name that we chose. We also, another factor that we considered was my husband and I actually both speak other languages. We
Hmm.
we both speak Russian. We both have some experience with German as well. And so one of the things that we considered is how translatable is this name?
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
would you be able to, use it naturally in other languages? Because, that's partly something that I had issues with growing up in other
Hmm.
countries. My first name is actually Elaine. And like in Portuguese, people would butcher that really bad and it'd come out like Elaine, which
Hmm.
I not really a fan of. So what I ended up doing a lot of the time growing up, and which I still do actually when I'm speaking other languages, is I'll actually use modified versions of my name that work in other languages. So instead of Elaine, it would be like Elena
Hmm.
or Liana, and doing things like that. But yeah, that was another thing that we considered in naming our child.
Yeah, that's something that not a lot of people consider, but I think because of your very unique background. And we won't say what your kid's name is for privacy's sake, but having met the child, very good name, solidly translatable across pretty much all languages, I would say.
Yeah, we were pretty happy with it. So
Yeah, yeah. Maybe we can touch a bit on like gender and language, and maybe did the gender or the biological sex of your child when you found it out, did that, like, how did that influence your naming choices?
yeah, so we definitely did look at a lot of more gender neutral names that like could go either way.
Hmm.
We definitely considered several of those. I mean, there's a lot of them in English like that. Jordan, Taylor, Morgan, like
Hmm.
there's a ton of names that could go either way. And some of them I quite like.
Hmm.
So that was definitely something that we considered. And from like a philosophical standpoint, I hate how everything is gendered for children from like a super young age, little
Yeah.
kids, little boys getting toy cars and little girls getting Barbie dolls. Like, there's no reason for that from a very young age. And then a lot of that can actually lead to the discrepancies that we see, decades later in the
Hmm.
workforce when, you end up with more men in the sciences because even as little kids, they were given more toys that led them to develop the skills that are applicable in the sciences.
Hmm.
And so, from more of an ethical standpoint, I
Hmm.
really hate how that happens. But at the same point, I can't totally remove my child from the culture, from the world that we live in. And
Yeah.
so I wouldn't say that that was like the most important thing for me, especially in naming my child.
Mm-hmm.
I do definitely want to give him opportunities that aren't just gendered male or like stereotypically male. Like I've given him a doll, which, was never really my thing personally growing up either.
Mm-hmm.
But like I do want to have him have multiple opportunities and be able to choose his own path thoroughly
Mm-hmm.
in life. And like, yeah, naming does fall into that in some way. But if someone wants to, they can always change their name. They can always go by a nickname. Like there's other things that you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of naming practices, EJ and I have a shared experience when it comes to like later in life naming, and like nicknames and stuff. So EJ and I met through capoeira, which is an Afro-Brazilian martial art. And it is like a traditional practice in capoeira to get like a nickname of sorts, like a street name is kind of what it's like. So because capoeira was illegal for years and years and years, and so to avoid, like, if you got caught and they were asking like, who are you playing with, you would say, I'm playing with Dung Beetle over there, and they're like, who the crap is Dung Beetle? You don't know.
Yeah. So for those listeners who don't know, like Stacy said, capoeira is an Afro-Brazilian martial art, and it does have a rather entailed history where first it started with, the people who were enslaved brought over from Africa wanting to fight and not get punished for it. And so they disguised the martial art as a dance. And that's where you have, music attached to it. We call it playing capoeira instead of like fighting capoeira or sparring capoeira. And yeah, the nicknames are a huge part of it because there was quite a long time in Brazil when capoeira was illegal because of its reputation, and there's a long
There and a
history
lot of
around
like
that.
racism and all the fun stuff. It's great. It's a rich history. For
Mhm.
more information about capoeira, I highly recommend a podcast by our friend Azul, called Only the Strong. Also available wherever our podcast is, their podcast is, and I highly recommend you check it out if you're interested in capoeira or want to learn more. It's a great tool. But that kind of brings in the other subject of like alternative naming, right? Like capoeira very much like had a reason to like use alternative names, but other subcultures use like nicknaming as well. Like I've been following a girl on TikTok who's talked a lot about different subcultures and like the alternative cultures, punk subculture, gothic subculture. All, in different subcultures, people will also get nicknames, and that's how you know that you're a part of the group, right? Is like once you get a nickname, you are incorporated.
And that's how it is partly with
Yeah,
capoeira as well. Like you don't usually get your nickname on the first day,
definitely not.
but and actually, so the events that you go to in capoeira where people will get new chords, which is equivalent in lots of ways to belts in other martial arts. So those events where you get chords and where you gather tons of people together are actually called batizados, which means
Mhm.
baptisms. And part of the tradition associated with that can be getting a name. A lot of times people will be given names before that though by their
Yeah,
teachers.
mine was given to me very casually after class one day, sitting on the couch.
Right. Yeah, mine was just given to me in a class as well. But yeah, I'm not sure if our friend Azul's podcast Only the Strongest has an episode on names
I mean,
specifically.
maybe they've been potting for a while, so
They have
I'm
a lot
sure
of
they've
them.
hit it up at least a couple of times. I'd have to take a look, but yeah, naming in subcultures is really like important too,
Mhm.
and it's very interesting when you do get like a nickname or something like that is a sign of being invested in this group, and that's something that you see in like a lot of different places, not even like within capoeira and with other subcultures and all this other stuff. Taking on a new name is like it's like a big deal, right? Like that's it's
Mhm.
got some like heavy cultural significance to whichever group you're a part of.
Definitely. And then you'll have cultures where, you can be given a name that's actually sacred and that like you're only supposed to use in very specific situations. Or you have cultures where people really don't care all that
Mm-hmm.
much.
And you have
So,
other cultures where you like collect names, like family names. I'm thinking about
mm,
like Hispanic cultures, like Mexican cultures, where people can have a name that's like 10 names long, but that's because like family is really important, and making sure your family is represented in your name is very important. So having a long name can also be very significant for a lot of people.
and that's actually a really interesting point because lots of cultures do last names
Mm-hmm.
differently. So, like Stacy just said, in a lot of the Spanish speaking world, you have two people get married and they'll concatenate the last names for their children. And so you end up with really, really long names.
Mm-hmm.
In the US, it's more traditionally common for women to take on their husband's last name when they get married, but there's other places where that's the case as
Mm-hmm.
well, although there's some people who are choosing to do it differently
Mm-hmm.
now. But then you have like in Iceland, they use patronymics. And so you don't have a last name the same way that we do in the US. Instead, your last name is son of so and so or daughter of so and so. And that actually used to be widespread in other parts of Europe as well. But Iceland actually still does that.
Yeah.
But that's where, there's names like Johnson, Peterson that are extremely common, and those originate from patronymics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, naming practices are absolutely fascinating. And while we're kind of talking about global names and how global names are structured, I would also like to point out in like East Asia, in like places like China, and I think in Japan as well, often the last name will be said first, where you'll say your family name and then you'll say your first name. Or more often, you're referred to by your family name, and your first name is usually only used in the home or with very close friends or relatives, which I think
Right.
actually used to be common in like in Europe as well. If like I was actually just reading Pride and Prejudice, and that's another common thing, is referring to people by their last names before their Christian names or their first names.
Right, which is so interesting. So I lived in Iceland for, a couple of years around seventh grade. And in Iceland, partly because they use patronymics, like they don't do the whole Mr. last name thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the US, that's kind of a formality thing. Like if you have teachers in a classroom, you're going to refer to them with, Mr., Ms., whichever title they prefer, and then the last name. In Iceland, the formality is different. And so you actually refer to teachers by their first names. And so I was in Iceland for a couple of years, and then I moved to Guangzhou, China, where formality and like respect for your elders and all of that is a much bigger
Yeah.
deal. And for me, it was super weird to go from like speaking to my teachers on this first name basis to like them not really wanting to talk to me and going again by their last names.
Mm-hmm.
But it's an interesting thing, and it's kind of similar in some ways to like this is a little bit tangential, but we've talked a bit about formality in the
Yeah.
past, and there's lots of different ways that formality comes into play. And one of the interesting things about it is that you can be using very, very respectful, technically formal language, but in like a sarcastic and disrespectful way. Or you can be using very friendly language in a very respectful way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, even though languages have like different ways of showing these things, and names can sometimes be a part of that, it's much more complex than just saying, oh, in this place they do this, therefore they're more formal and have more respect. That's not necessarily the
Yeah,
case.
I mean, I would suggest that less about like formality and more about like social structures, right? Like in the case
Mhm.
of Iceland, you know, it's less about like the formality behind the last name and more about like who are you related to, right? Like who is your father, who is your mother? And that's more important, and that's why the naming convention is the way that it is. Similarly, if you have your last name first or you go by your family name, that often like in those areas it might be more valuable to have that name associated with your family, where your family's reputation is an important factor. So being like addressed by your last name is more significant, right? So yeah, formalities are very interesting topic, which we should probably do a whole other episode on.
We should.
But I
We
think it is
should.
fascinating how you can kind of see where values and how values might shift depending on like naming practices. Like here in the United States, we're very, very individualistic. And so our first names are very important, you know, and more often than not, people get addressed by their first names. Or, you
Mm.
know, there are like some circumstances where you do get addressed by your last name, but that's usually like, you know, there's an age discrepancy or you're not super familiar with the person, or, you know, it is like a teacher student kind of relationship sort of a thing. But yeah, it's very interesting to see how people's values and their naming conventions might kind of coincide.
Yeah. And along with that, you know, there's some places where they have a prescribed set of names that you have to choose
Mhm.
from.
Again, Iceland.
Uh, again, Iceland, and, you know, it might be biblical names, it might be traditional names in that
Mhm.
culture. But there can actually be rules that you have to name your child from this list of names. That's very oppositional to the individualistic Americans who want their child's name to be different. And actually, Utah, where I live, has a little bit of a reputation for parents naming their children very creative names with extremely creative spellings as well.
Yeah, yeah. It's very fascinating. But what's also interesting is when you look at like naming trends as well and seeing how naming trends change over time. And there are people who like specialize in like naming trends and such. But in kind of like the vein of people being like individualistic and wanting unique names, there is also something to be said about choosing a popular name. Like when names come and go, it's usually because of like a celebrity or like something else, or, you know, sort of like these days there's like a vintage trend going around, like having a retro name or a vintage name, a name from like the 1920s is becoming really like popular again because those are a little bit unique, they're a little bit nostalgic, something that like people really vibe with, which I think is
Mhm.
absolutely fascinating. And there is like time periods in which like names are super popular. So like my
Definitely.
name, for example, Stacy, is a little bit unique because of my age, right? Like there was a period in time, it was like, you know, late 80s, early 90s, where the name Stacy was hugely popular. So you'll find a lot of people in now they're coming up in their 40s, but like early millennials, a lot of them have the name Stacy. And I've been told by a number of Stacys that I'm the last of that like sort of generation of name,
Mm.
because I'm for the just to let you know, I'm turning 25 here in a couple weeks. I'm only 25, so I'm like a late millennial, early Gen Z, however you want to classify it. I don't care. But I'm like the youngest Stacy that people know because right around like the 1995, 96, the name just kind of puttered out and people were just not using it anymore. And so my mom was a little bit creative and being like, I'm gonna keep using this name because I like it.
Definitely. It's kind of the same with my name,
Yeah.
actually. Like I said, my first name is Elaine, and that name is most common, you know, that I've run into it with people more my grandparents'
Mm-hmm.
age and my grandparents' generation. But for me, it is actually a family name that has been passed down through the generations. And that's, you know, probably part of why My parents really liked it, and it's a great name.
Yeah. So it's very interesting to see how naming trends kind of like come and go. And like I said, there are people who spend their whole lives studying
Mm-hmm.
like naming structures, nomenclature, like all how names come to be, what causes a name to like rise in popularity and fall,
Definitely.
and all this very interesting stuff.
There's one other aspect we haven't really touched on, and I think it's less common in
Mhm.
English, but meaning behind names, right?
Yeah.
In a lot of languages, like the meaning of a name is actually going to be really, really important. Versus in the US, a lot of names have roots in other languages and other cultures, and we don't even really think about the meanings that much anymore.
Yeah, there are some people who do, but most people I would say are more interested in how it sounds or how it looks, how it kind of
Exactly.
fits.
Mhm.
It's more aesthetic than like meaningful. And I mean, aesthetics have meaning too, right? But still, they're like the underlying meaning behind a name. Like I remember when I was in Morocco with the family that I was staying with, we were talking about like the meanings of their names because over there it was like really important. And like luckily I had a fascination with names beforehand, so I knew like the meaning behind my name and I could kind of participate in the discussion. But a lot of people don't know the meaning behind their name, whereas like my Moroccan friends were able to just say, oh yeah, my name means like angel, or my name means this, or my name means that. So there are like definitely cultures out there where the meaning behind your name is something that you are inherently aware of because it was important for your parents to choose that name with that meaning.
Definitely. Cool. Well, is there anything else that you would like to bring up with names?
I mean, we could go on and on when it comes to names. I've said this is like the third time of me saying it. There's a lot to digest with names. But I think maybe we can save the idea of sound symbolism for a little bit later when we talk about wug tests and Kiki and Booba and all that fun stuff. There's a professor at my university who specializes in, well, a lot of her research has lately been around sound symbolism. So I'm familiar with the topic. And that kind of goes back to like naming a little bit of how sound symbolism connects to like names and meanings of names and how names are structured and all that stuff. But we can save that for another day
Yeah,
because
we'll
it's
definitely come back to that.
quite a hefty topic. But yeah, I think this was like a good general overview of like names and naming patterns. Just a little taste of like the massive amounts of information there is out there about names.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much for listening. We'll try and get more episodes out to you soon.
Thanks all. We'll see you later.